Hello, everyone. I hope you're doing very well. I want to say a few things in this video in relationship to chapter number 3 on the self. And but before I do that, I just want to stress a couple of things about your discussion boards. So first of all, your discussion boards overall are very good, and I enjoy reading them, and I enjoy replying to them. The other thing is make sure that your reflections are logically connected to your question. In other words, make sure that your question is logically related to your reflection, because in some of your reflections you engage in descriptions that are not and reflections that are not directly related to your questions. So make sure you keep it tight and logical. Okay, you don't need to engage in overly descriptive, you don't need to engage in describing the content from the chapters too much, because we all read chapters and more or less we know what you are talking about. So make sure, so keep the citations, keep the references to specific examples, clinical examples and concepts the way you do, but avoid overly winded or long descriptions because they are really unnecessary. So a good paragraph is sufficient, and then pose a question or questions. But as I said before, many of you have been doing very well on this front, and keep up the good work. Okay, so now on to chapter number 3. By now we've learned quite a few things about consciousness, a few things about the brain and the relationship between the two. By now you also can see that one of the main features of consciousness is subjectivity. And subjectivity is the hallmark of the self, because what else would it be if it wasn't subjectivity? That is, experiencing the world, your psychological world, and the physical world that you exist in from the first person perspective. We have also learned that, so that is, before I move on, that is the main relationship or connection between consciousness and subjectivity. When consciousness takes place, when the brain is in a state, in an ideal state to produce consciousness neuronally, and as it exists in an environment, so that the way it is triggered by the environment, it gives rise to conscious states, and this is true for human beings and also many other animals. So when that happens, we experience, as subjects, we experience subjectivity, or the first person perspective, or what Thomas Nagel says, what it feels like to be subject perspective. Now, this perspective, the first person perspective, as I have just described, is completely different from the third person perspective. The third person perspective vis-a-vis the first person perspective is quite different, because the third person perspective is the objective scientific perspective. The first person perspective, or the subjective perspective, or what it feels like to be a conscious subject, is a psychological point of view that we all enjoy. And the moment when you want to engage in the third person perspective, the moment that you want to peer into the brain and unlock the neuronal mechanisms, you lose the first person perspective. So the first person perspective disappears or is dissolved, and then you move into the third person perspective. Now, when you do the reverse, when you move from the third person perspective to the first person perspective, you lose the perspective of objectively looking at neuronal mechanisms in the brain, and you find yourself in the first person perspective. So you can't have it both ways. That is, you can't have the cake and eat it too. That is impossible. Okay, so and that is why it has been difficult to build a bridge of understanding, philosophical and scientific understanding, between the first person perspective and the third person perspective. And in our case, for our purposes, consciousness, between consciousness and or conscious states and brain states. Okay, now the other thing that I want to mention is that the self is really composed of three different features, and they are more or less, let's say, equally important. So first feature is subjectivity, right? The first person perspective that always comes with consciousness. In some pathological cases, as you will see very soon, that changes. There is a specific pathology that enters into the first person perspective, the way we feel, the way we experience ourselves. And then that pathology becomes pathology of the self. But we will get to that soon. Let's just stick to everyday experiences. Excuse me. So we have the first person perspective, what it feels like to be a subject, what it feels like to be yourself. But that is not the whole picture of what the self is. The self is also composed or embodied or composed of a body. So the self really never exists without a body. Okay, I am attached to my body, I am in my body, and whatever I do on daily basis involves the body. So if I go for a walk, if I go for a run, if I see my friends for a beer, or we go out for dinner, if I go out, if I play tennis, the body allows me to do specific things, or prevents me from doing specific things. Either way, I'm never really detached or outside of my body. What can happen is the body can either be in the foreground of my conscious focus or involvement, or it could be in the background. Okay, so when I play tennis, I focus on specific things that are bodily, whether am I moving well, am I fast enough, do I change direction well enough, am I strong enough, will I get to the ball, and so on and so forth. And also the dimensions of the court and where I am on the court with my body. Okay, that is very important. So the act is quite embodied, but at the same time, I make very quick cognitive decisions. That which relates to my perception of the ball and speed of the ball, or the trajectory of the ball. So you can see that the body is in the foreground, but the mind is also there, you could say, in the foreground, but sometimes it recedes into background. Another simple example is, let's say, when you are maybe learning how to dance, new moves. Let's say you want to learn how to dance salsa or ballroom dancing or tango, and you don't know how to do that. You're a novice, you're starting off, you're a greenhorn. Then you really pay attention to what you do with your feet, with your arms, and it's usually a pleasurable experience, but it's a novel experience that has to do with the body. even though you are conscious, but the body is in the foreground, and the rest of your cognitive or conscious experiences or states are in the background. Now, when you are sitting on a couch or maybe on a train or wherever it may be, and you lose yourself in your thoughts or your memories, or you plan ahead for a trip, or you fantasize about something pleasurable, then the mind, your first person perspective as a conscious subject, that is in the foreground, and the body is in the background. It doesn't really matter where you sit. It doesn't really matter which way you're facing. What the body does is not really important, as long as it is in a position that where you can self-reflect or wander inside your mind about many different things, whatever it may be. Okay, so the first feature of the self is subjectivity or consciousness, or being a conscious subject. The second feature is embodiment. We are never really without a body, we're always embodied. And the third feature is that we are embedded in a given environment. So right now I am embedded in the environment of my apartment, but I'm also in the environment of looking at a camera and talking to you. Not directly, but indirectly. And that has specific feedback for how I act and what I can do with my body. The environment that I am in affects me directly, and then my output or the choices that I make are dependent on the environment or the feedback that I get from the environment. So this is also true when I step out of my environment, or when I go to work, or, well, now I am actually at work right now, but if I, let's say, go physically back to Centennial College, or if I go out with my friends, or if I go to a concert, or if I go to a professional basketball game or a tennis game, or if I go on a date, each situation is composed of a specific environment that affects me directly. So everything that the body does and all the environments that we are in is filtered through the self. And the self reacts in a specific manner to the position of its body and what the body does and how it behaves, or what it can do, and also the body in a given environment. So really the three components work together. They're not really, you can't really dissociate them. You can dissociate them abstractly or theoretically, conceptually, that is, but when it comes to practice and real life, the mind or consciousness is always attached to a body, and the two are always in a given environment. So this is important because it relates to Northof's conclusion at the end of chapter 3. And then the conclusion of chapter 3 is that the self is neurosocial. Okay, by neuro, he means it relates to the brain and specifically to the resting state activity. Now remember, without a healthy resting state, the subject, or a given subject, that is, yourself, cannot have a dialogue with its immediate environment that is composed of objective things, and also an environment that is composed of social organizations such as schools, restaurants, family get-togethers, and dialogues with your friends or your loved ones or your boyfriends or your girlfriends, wives or husbands or partners. Okay, so so that is the neural component, and the social component is the embedded component, the situation, the environmental situation that you find yourself in. Now, the environmental situation that you find yourself in has a direct effect on what the self is, how the self is constructed, and what the self does in future. So right now you are in school, and the environment of the learning environment and the social environment of being in school is going to, it molds your brain as we speak, and it's going to mold your brain into a specific subject that is your let's say your resting state in the future, and that is going to pave way for your future relationships with yourself and with other people. Okay, so in other words, the process of going through school changes who you are, hopefully positively, and I believe it will be positive, definitely more positive than negative. And when that's the case, then you will become, when you exit school and go into professional life, then the self that you will be by the end of the process, the process of going through school, is of course going to be different from the moment when you enter. It is going to basically, the process of going through school or schooling will shape you in a specific manner, and it will shape your resting state and other cognitive abilities. So the spatial temporal neuronal pathways that will be created through the schooling process will determine the kind of subject or the kind of person you will be by the end of the schooling process. And of course, it doesn't end there. Of course, school, quote unquote, school or learning never really ends, but that will make you in a specific, that will make a specific subject or a specific person by the time you end school or you graduate. Now, one of the experiments that's key to remember here, that the self is indeed social, not removed from social environments or social relationships with others or other environments, is that when participants were given tasks to engage in self-reference or self-related processing, so when subjects were given, let's say, pictures of themselves vis-a-vis or in contrast to pictures of famous people or pictures of people, especially faces, of people that they did not know, there was no difference in resting state activity. That is, there was no difference between typical self-related processing, that is, pictures of oneself, as opposed to pictures of people, of other people. So if there's no difference in, according to Northrop, if there's no difference in self-related activity, that is, activity of resting state, then resting state is composed of subjectivity and also the social interactions that you go through on a daily basis in your life. So the self is neurosocial. Neural meaning relates to the brain and specifically to resting states and the social environments that that affect you daily and compose the self daily. So that is why Northrop says that the self is neurosocial. So the self is really composed of three different things. It's composed of the subject from the first person perspective, consciousness. It's composed of the body that you enjoy on a daily basis. And it's composed of the environment that you are located in and function in on a regular basis. So it's a three-part, you could say that the self is composed of three different features or three parts, okay? Subjectivity, consciousness, the body, and embeddedness in a given environment. And practically, you really engage in all three on a regular basis. The self is really composed of the three components on a regular basis. And you really never really exist devoid of consciousness. You never really exist devoid of embodiment, that is in relationship to your body. And you never really exist devoid of embeddedness or without your environment. Either a typical physical environment, let's say the camera that I'm looking into and speaking to right now, or the environment or social environment. So when children grow up in an environment of family members, the embeddedness, the environment that they're in directly affects who they are and how they evolve and who they become in the future. So that's why it is so important to surround yourself with people who are positive, who are knowledgeable, who can teach you something new, who can be your friends, and who can love you. Because if that's not the case, then the opposite takes place. Okay, all the positive features that I have just mentioned that come from being embedded in a social environment or socializing with other people can have a negative effect on people. Okay, so we can see that in many different pathological cases, and we will go through some of them as we move through the course. But the main takeaway here is that we are never really detached from our environments, and our environments affect us on a daily basis, and they structure the self that we are or we become moment by moment in our lives. Okay, so I think that's it. I think that these are the most important elements, and I leave the rest of our discussion to the discussion boards. So I look forward to reading your discussion boards, and next week we are focusing on five or six, I think it's 5 different kinds of self-knowledge. So you will be able to see the logical connection between what we have done so far, moving into the next chapter and the following chapters. And then I think after the 3 weeks, we will go back to Northov's book. All right, well, that's basically it. And I will chat with you on the discussion boards, and I hope you're doing very well, and I wish all of you a really good weekend. Take care.